This happened a few months ago in the beginning of summer. I've held off on sharing it for so long because I didn't want to be judged for my actions. I joined this stupid online dating app since I divorced last winter. Just kind of living it up, you know? I somehow matched with this man who lived in New York, an 8-hour drive from me. After texting for a few weeks, he sprung it on me that he was going to drive to see me. Since I'm staying with family since my divorce, I decided we'd get a hotel. He told me he'd find one and pay for it. I already felt super bad he was driving so far, so I was trying to find deals and the cheapest place that wasn't sketchy as fuck. I lived about 45 minutes outside of the city in the state that I live in. I'm not super familiar with some areas, so the hotel I booked ended up being no bueno, but I didn't know this until I got there. It was dark by the time I had arrived after getting lost 4 different times. There was a very shady motel right across the street with 2 men smoking cigarettes on the porch. Lots of truckers and travelers traveling through. I just walked into that hotel like, shit, I just fucked up. But I went with it anyway, because I really didn't have a choice. And NY, what we'll refer to him as, was only an hour away, so he'd be there very soon. The hotel was run by Jamaicans, I think a family, but this comes into play later, which is why I mention it. The woman who checked me in was nice, but the entire place just gave off these weird vibes. The lighting, the smell of bleach, the carpet, I don't really know. It was really bright, but also really heavy and dark, if that makes sense. I started shaking as I was trying to check in. The reservation was under NY's name. At first, she told me she couldn't find it. His last name was Spanish, so I thought maybe I was pronouncing it wrong, even though I'm pretty good with Spanish. This made it awkward, because now she knew I was meeting a stranger. I thought maybe he gave you the wrong name, she said. I'd nervously chuckled. She put me on the 2nd floor. I was expecting an elevator, but as I turned, I saw that behind me was a huge carpeted staircase. This threw me off too. I don't really know why. I get to my room and just pace around, waiting for this stranger from the internet to finally show up. It starts raining. I'm sitting by the window sipping a glass of wine when I see a pickup truck pull in. Maybe it's him. A man in a black hoodie gets out and locks his truck and runs inside. I start panicking, thinking it's him. He had no bags or luggage because he was going to come kidnap me or something. There was a loud knock on my door. I jumped so hard I immediately stood up. I made my way over to the door and looked through the peephole. This was NY. No black hoodie, carrying lots of bags with him, so I crack the door open and smile. He comes in and I share my terrifying thoughts with him and we chuckle. Sex happens. Later that night we fall asleep. He's spooning me but also has his arms all the way around me with his head on top of mine. It was a weird position. I was woken from a dead sleep, just so sweaty because he was holding me so tightly. I thought that's what had woken me up. But then I heard it. Someone was fucking with our door. I heard the handle start moving as whoever it was tried to open it, but it wouldn't open so easily. NY jumped out of bed so fast I wondered how long he'd been awake listening to this to react so quickly. I pulled the covers up to my chin as he was standing in the dark in his undies looking at the door. He looked through the peephole and said he thought it was one of the Jamaican men who worked there. We had a chain on the door as well as all the locks, so he kept the chain on as he opened it just a few inches. Before he could even ask what the man wanted, he just said this, "Is the white girl in there?" I remember getting chills all over my body immediately. NY said no and slammed the door, almost completely unbothered by this. The man said something about needing a credit card from me. NY yells back that the room is on his card under his name and he'll take care of everything in the morning. I looked at the clock and it was like 2 fucking a.m. I turn over and just stare at the wall hoping I can fall back to sleep. NY wrapped his arms around me again and is immediately snoring in my ear. Good thing he was hot, I guess. The next morning we decide to get breakfast. It's super early and we're both feeling groggy. I'm hoping as we round the corner to the stairs that no one is at the front desk, because they definitely heard the noises from our room this morning, and I was feeling really embarrassed. Thankfully, the front desk was indeed empty. Then I saw him, though. An older black male standing a few feet from the exit. I honestly don't know if he was really Jamaican. I don't know if he was actually a part of the family who owned this place even, or a guest, or just someone else. I don't know. But his face was sunken in, and he had this weird chilling look in his eyes as he glared right at me. I knew immediately upon seeing him this was the same guy from last night. NY whispers for me to just keep walking, so I break eye contact with this guy and lean into NY as we make our way to the exit. As we pass by, the man is silent. As I'm pushing open the door to exit the building, he starts saying, "There's the white girl. I found the white girl. She makes a lot of noise." I was terrified. I left for work after breakfast. I was gone a few hours and returned to the hotel to find the room empty. I texted NY and asked where he was. He texted back saying he was in the laundry room and he'd be right back up. I sat down on the bed waiting for him. I heard some footsteps outside the door, the floor creaking like someone was standing there shifting their weight or something. I figured maybe NY had forgotten his room key, so I got up to look through the damn peephole, but it was not him. The creepy man was standing outside the door just staring into the peephole. I jumped back and started crying. I called NY and yelled for him to come to the room quickly because that man was outside the door. He was long gone by the time NY got there. He went down to the front desk and spoke to the woman about this man, but she just kept saying she had no idea who he was talking about and she would keep an eye out for whoever this was. That night I couldn't sleep. I just felt I could feel him lingering around outside the door, but I was too scared to actually look. NY was sleeping at this point. I rolled over and decided to be the big spoon and wrap my arms around him. He was basically still a stranger, but this was the most comforting thing I had at the moment. We checked out the next morning. I grabbed his hand as we made our way down the stairs, because guess who was standing right there? Yep. The woman from the front desk was now gone, replaced by a younger male. The creepy man was standing there smiling as we neared the bottom of the stairs, just this awful bone-chilling grin. "You're a lucky man with a white girl like that," was the last comment we heard from this creep. NY spun around and told him to fuck off, then walked me to my car. He waited while I drove off to make sure no one followed me. I don't know, maybe there's more we could have done. But again, the man never did anything physical or anything. It was just a really unnerving experience. About a month later, I was telling my dad about it. He laughed and told me I had picked the worst part of the city, and he thought he had heard about this place being shut down multiple times for drugs or sex trafficking. I can't remember. It would always go under new ownership. So I had known this woman since before I could even remember. She was really good friends with my mom and dad through high school, so I already knew her before all of this. Unfortunately, my mother was an alcoholic and pill addict, which led to pretty bad neglect for several years when I was very young. A story for another day, perhaps. After missing most of my third grade year, DCS got involved, and my dad got custody of me. He was dating my stepmother at the time, and at first everything was fairly normal. She was like an older sister to me, like a good friend. It wasn't too long, though, before I noticed things start to change. One day, when I was about 9, I was sitting in the living room floor playing with my back against the couch. My stepmother crossed the living room to go down the hallway, and as she did, seemed to shoulder check the doorway. As soon as she did this, she turned around and started yelling at me, accusing me of pushing her. I stared at her dumbfounded, because I hadn't ever moved from my spot on the floor. She continued yelling and accusing me as I tried to rationalize everything in my head. Maybe I'd gotten up and didn't remember, but why would I push her? I had no negative feelings toward her at this point, so it really didn't make any sense. But she was an adult, and I was a child. Surely, she must know what she was talking about. Stepmother was a taller, skinny woman with long golden blonde hair, straightened through the length with those poofy 80s bangs on top. She typically wore high-waisted jeans and kept long, pristine red nails that would end up being a horrifying symbol to me in my teen years. Things only got worse as I got older. I would speak to my mom on occasion over the phone or in letter over the first few years, but each time I did, stepmother would become more and more hostile toward me, claiming my contact with my mother was making me misbehave. But I was always an introvert. I loved reading and school. I was a bit of a nerd and hated getting into trouble, so this accusation really didn't sit right with me even then. But what could I do about it? I was just a kid. Before too long, I noticed that stepmother looked for any opportunity alone with me, to treat me however she wanted. She quickly became extremely militant. Each morning, she woke me up for school by bursting into my room and aggressively jerking the covers from my body. Some mornings even grabbing my feet and digging her nails in, twisting my toes. I was expected to follow a strict schedule on school mornings. 6:15, get out of bed. 6:15 to 6:25 a.m., get dressed for school. 6:25, have breakfast. At this time, I was expected to stand in the exact center point of the threshold between the kitchen and the dining room, ready to take my breakfast and sit in my spot at the table. 6:35, I was to be done. 6:45, finish getting ready for school. And at that point, be sitting Indian style in the center of the living room, waiting on everyone to be ready. If I did not follow this schedule down to the exact minute, punishment would be doled out severely. She would grab my hands on taking my breakfast, twisting one or two fingers out of the socket, pulling me close to grit through her teeth at me with glaring, hateful eyes. Sometimes she would step in, including my feet, grinding her heels into my bare skin, twisting and glaring hate into me. On a few occasions, she even broke my wood hairbrushes across my face, leaving busted blood vessels and massive bruises. When the damage was too obvious, she would try to hide me away for a day or so, gently waking me the next morning, acting as though I was just sick, and telling me I was too ill to go to school, brushing my hair back gently and telling me to just go back to sleep. This treatment rolled over into my days after school too, and would evolve into other aggressive behaviors. She made sure to conceal any sign of mistreatment from my father, but some still happened right underneath his nose. At the dinner table, she would dig her toes into my leg and scrape so hard she would shave off chunks of skin from my shins with her toenails. Even at church, placing what looked like an affectionate hand on my back, but would proceed to give me an extremely painful and deep pinch on my back, leaving huge bruises in their place that no one would ever see. I was given an hour and a half after school each day to do my homework. After that, I was expected to go to our playroom, where I was to entertain her daughter. Her daughter was between 5 and 7 when things started to get really bad. I was expected to play what she wanted, when she wanted, and abide by any request she made. This was never said explicitly, but understood and later learned the hard way. One day during the summer, while eating lunch with her daughter in the playroom, she asked me to open her dessert. She had this kid cuisine that she had merely taken all but 2 bites of. Stepmother would typically leave the plastic on her dessert as a system to encourage her to eat her dinner first. Of course, when she asked me to open it, I asked her if she was done eating her meal, passively addressing the fact she had barely touched it. I was about 14 at the time, and it seemed like a plausible thing to big sister her about. But when I didn't give her exactly what she wanted, she got up in a huff to go tattle to her mother, as most 6-year-olds tend to do. While the stepmother was immediately enraged and barreled down the hallway in my direction, I don't even think I was out of view of her daughter when she grabbed me by the hair and started dragging me away. I tried to keep up but lost my balance and fell to the floor as she continued to drag me down the hallway by my hair. Once we reached my bedroom, she started kicking me in the stomach, then pulled me to my feet to face the bed. She then began rummaging through my belt drawer and pulled out my woven leather belt she had already used more than once, then proceeded to beat me with it, starting at my shoulder blades all the way down to my ankles. Heaven forbid if I screamed, she would just beat me even more. The abuse also did not stop with the physical, as she seemed to get a real kick out of bullying me. This she wasn't so worried about hiding from my father. She would make it seem so light-hearted and jovial when he was around. One evening, while having a family dinner at one of our local go-to sit-downs, she started kicking me under the table, passing me horribly evil glares. After a few minutes of this, she spoke up. "You chew like a cow. Why can't you chew right? Doesn't she chew like a cow?" My dad chuckled, thinking it was meant lightheartedly, but as he looked down at his meal again, her death glare staring a hole through me with a tight jaw and grit teeth told me otherwise. This became a new target for her abuse. She did this again later when she noticed that I walked on the inside of my house shoes, one day kicking me in the back of my knees and making me fall to the floor. She began kicking me in the back, knocking the wind out of me, all over the simple way that I walked. This became daily life. Speaking out seemed ridiculous because all of these punishments just felt so absurd. I didn't tell anyone for a long time, but as I got older, the people around me got wiser. When I was in middle school, my dad and stepmother were called in for questioning by the school. Two of my teachers were highly suspicious of my bruises and constantly swollen fingers. Stepmother proceeded to put on an act, crying and acting hurt and shocked they would even think she would hurt a child. I changed schools after that year. Things got worse when I went to high school. She seemed to be intimidated by my aging and gaining maturity. Male friends were off limits, and my curves were to be hidden by horribly unflattering clothes. I really didn't mind that so much, as I had little interest in boys or displaying my womanhood to any degree. However, one afternoon while taking a shower, she burst into the bathroom to remind me of my timing. As she whipped the bathtub curtain open, she saw the hair growing below my waist. Before I could react, she grabbed the hair and jerked it down, pulling out a handful of my pubic hair. She cursed me for not telling her I had started maturing in that way. I couldn't tell anyone about that for years. After the belt beating, however, stepmother's sister-in-law saw my backside and called my dad at work, cursing him and threatening to report it. I started going to her house on the weekends after that. After this, someone standing up for me. I got braver and became less scared. Once I saw people reacting to what little they saw of my stepmother's behavior, I knew I was in the right for sticking up for myself. So I did. In subtle ways at first. Brought jewelry and makeup to school and started to give myself space to express myself. Then one morning, while running a minute or two behind on breakfast, stepmother came into the kitchen in a rage. Why wasn't I finishing getting ready for school? Before I could turn around from rinsing my dishes, she was rummaging in the utensil drawer and pulled out a fork. She backed me against the kitchen counter, pressing it to my throat. I don't remember what she said to me in those moments, but I remember her hot breath in my ear hissing through her teeth at me. I remember the chill of the cold metal prongs on my throat. I was only 16. My last day there was field day of my junior year. I decided to wear a cute outfit that her sister-in-law had bought me for casual days. It was a cute cap-sleeved striped t-shirt, cut femininely to suit my curves with long matching shorts. I knew she wouldn't like it, but I also knew it was completely appropriate for a girl my age, even very conservative in comparison to most of my other peers. She saw me as I was walking down the hallway towards my bedroom, and I saw the rage fill her. She came at me nails first, grabbing my arms and digging them in. This was when I snapped. I fought her off and shoved her into the wall. Rage filled me as I went to the living room to grab the phone. "If you ever touch me again, I'm going to call the cops." She went pale, and suddenly I wasn't so scared for myself anymore. I couldn't control myself and laughed when I saw. "You're scared," I said, suddenly enlightened. Her face went blank as she walked toward me. "If I have to make your dad choose between you or me, you know it's not going to be you," she said coldly. I ignored this sentiment, though, because I knew she was delusional to think something like that. I went to my bedroom and packed a bag. She didn't stop me, but she did make sure to let me know that if I left, I wasn't welcome back. I ended up spending that summer in Florida with my stepmother's sister-in-law and moved in with my grandmother for the next several years. I only saw her again once in my 20s. She had left my dad by the time I was out of high school for the man she had been cheating on him with the entire time. She and I spoke briefly over Facebook in that next year, and I confronted her about what she had put me and my dad through. Her response? "I'm sorry if you ever felt unloved. I was just really stressed, and you were a pretty rebellious kid." When I was in 3rd grade, I made a friend named Nicholas, Nicky for short. We were both on the quieter side compared to our classmates, and we both shared a love for pudding cups. One day at school, Nicky forgot his lunch at home, so I told him he could have my pudding cup instead. And that's how we first became friends. From that moment on, we shared my pudding cups every day. The other kids in our class used to tease us, accusing us of having crushes on each other, and chant that horrible KISSING song all the time. It had become customary for Nicky and I to separate ourselves from the other kids at recess and lunch. We had a big tree we would always meet under in the morning, at recess, and for a few minutes after school before our parents came to pick us up. Nicky lived with his older sister and single mother. He tried explaining the concept of divorce to me once, but in my 8-year-old mind it didn't make sense that his parents weren't still together, happily married. As you can imagine, my parents were married, and my home life was the epitome of the adoring nuclear family. Imagine Full House except with a mother who hadn't passed away yet, and a couple of cousins instead of uncles. I can't recall a single moment in my childhood where I felt unloved or uncared for in any way. I very soon realized that that was a rarity. During one of mine and Nicky's morning visits to the tree, as we had cleverly nicknamed it, he invited me to his birthday party. He excitedly unzipped his backpack and withdrew an invitation card made of blue construction paper. There was this big hand-drawn tree on the front, 2 little kids of approximately mine and Nicky's size and coloring, and a home address scribbled inside. To this day, I still have that card. When the bell rang, he and I ran inside with the rest of the kids, and I waited all day for him to give out the rest of his birthday invitations, but he never did. I was the only one he had invited. Because the other kids teased us so much, my 8-year-old mind had chalked it up to the conclusion that he didn't want any bullies there, and had therefore invited his only friend, me. Suffice to say, I was very flattered and happy. I gave the card to my mother later on in the evening. She smiled and said, "How cute," and very quickly gave me permission to go. It was actually my first non-family birthday party. The next day, I went to the store with my mother and older brother, and we picked out a birthday present for Nicky. He and I were both heavily into Transformers, so we got him this tiny one after getting permission from his mother. I wrapped it up in blue wrapping paper all by myself. His birthday was on the following Saturday. My mother dropped me off at Nicky's house, briefly speaking with his mother in the kitchen, discussing pickup times and how fast we were growing before kissing me on the forehead goodbye. Because Nicky, his sister, and I were the only ones there, we decided to play a couple of board games and then tag when it wasn't raining anymore. We were in the backyard. It got to be a little sunny after, and Nicky and I fell deep into our dramatic reenactment of the latest and most exciting Power Rangers episode to date. That we had seen at least. His sister, a preteen at the time, went inside for a minute to check something, which Nicky would later reveal to me was a code phrase she used when she wanted to talk to the cute neighbor boy on the phone. Inside the kitchen, his mother was cooking and keeping an eye on us through the window. It was only as we went inside to eat that I realized there were no decorations. In fact, there wasn't anything to signify that it was Nicky's birthday at all, except for the homemade chocolate cake. I had loosely gathered that Nicky's family didn't have a lot of money, and that maybe that was the reason he went to school without lunch so often. But I'd never really asked him about it, and he never said anything either. Not that an 8-year-old would do either of those things. We went down to the basement after we cut the cake and took a couple of photos, where there was a tiny TV and an SNES. We played video games for roughly 10 minutes before there was this loud knock at the door. Nicky stopped the game, Yoshi's Island, and jogged up the basement stairs to answer the door, eventually screaming, "Dad, I thought you wouldn't come." He was very excited, understandably so considering how rarely he saw his father and what a big occasion it was in his life when he did. He would always tell me about it at school, that his cool, fun dad came to visit and took him for a ride around the block on his motorcycle. For a while, I'll admit I wasn't sure if I believed his dad owned a motorcycle, but when Nikki came down to introduce me to him, I followed them outside into the front yard and saw this big black Harley parked in the driveway. There were 2 helmets, one for his dad and one for him. I was instantly jealous. My own father drove a minivan and wore polo shirts and cargo pants almost religiously. Nikki's dad, however, was the complete and total opposite of mine. He wasn't suburban at all. In fact, he looked just like a character out of The Outsiders. Right away, I thought he was real cool, and right away I wanted to fit in with them. I should also note that Nikki and I came from different ethnic backgrounds. He was white, I was not. Because I went to school with a majority of white kids and lived in a town with a majority white population, I found it very difficult to fit in sometimes. That was part of the reason I had grown so close to Nikki so quickly. He was pretty much the only kid in school who gave me the time of day, and I him. The other kids didn't like me because I looked different. And they didn't like Nikki because he wore old, faded clothes. He was raised on a modest salary. His mother had a few jobs, if I remember correctly. She was a waitress, a grocery store clerk, and a part-time janitor. For a single mother with 2 growing kids, a house, and a car that was always breaking down, she was really quite optimistic. I liked her quite a lot, actually. She was always really nice. Even when she caught one of the bullies in school shoving Nikki to the ground once, she was nice. So when she immediately wasn't nice to Nikki's father, and when she pulled him aside to ask him to leave the party right away, I couldn't help but wonder what was going on. My mother picked me up soon after, and I made a pact with Nikki that I would come over again very soon. Because my mother had finally met his in person and spoken with her, I was allowed to come over and play now. Before that, she would always tell me, not until I meet his mother. From that point on, I went over to Nikki's house 2 or 3 times every week. Sometimes his mother would be there. Sometimes his older sister would be there. One of them was always there to look after us and make sure we didn't get up to any trouble. We would usually just go down to his basement and play video games, or when the weather would allow it, we would ride bikes in the cul-de-sac and jump on his tiny trampoline. He was always better at flips than me, and my child mind kind of resented him for it. One time he tried to teach me how to front flip and I nearly landed on my head. The second I got to my feet, I ran away and started crying, mostly due to embarrassment. I just wanted Nikki to think I could hang, but I couldn't really do any of the cool things he could. My own parents thought those kinds of things were too dangerous and forbid me from jumping on Nikki's trampoline. I used to always do it though. Kids will be kids. Nikki seemed to think I was cool enough though, and to get my crybaby ass to feel better, he would admit that he was a little bit jealous of me. Jealous of my new clothes, my new bike, just everything new that I had. That was the first time he opened up to me about being less privileged. The SNES in his basement was an old gift from a cousin of his who lived in the next town over, but it barely worked half the time. That's probably why his cousin gave it away in the first place. We sat in his basement for a few minutes talking about all the little reasons we were jealous of each other. Then his sister came down to say she was going to the mall with her friends, but their dad was coming over to look after us. Their mother was at work that afternoon. For whatever reason, Nikki was shocked to hear his dad was coming over. I took it as a surprise visit and ran outside with Nikki when we heard the motorcycle. Indeed, his dad was there, and he also had a late birthday present for Nikki in his hands. It was a box, roughly the size of his head, and it was wrapped in a newspaper. When we went inside to open it, he made Nikki promise not to tell his mother what he'd gotten him. Apparently, his mother didn't want Nikki to get a present from his dad, but his dad had bought him something anyway. Nikki readily nodded, so I followed his lead. I watched Nikki tear the newspaper to shreds, revealing a brand new Polaroid camera. Nikki had no idea what it was at first, looking to his dad for answers, before I excitedly said, "A camera! You got a camera!" I could tell Nikki felt embarrassed he didn't know what it was right away, but he was just so happy to get something. He brushed the embarrassment aside and we opened the box to play with it. His dad taught us how to use it and explained how it worked to us as well. He pointed it at Nikki and snapped the first photo, flapping it in the air after, and showing us the final product. It was so cool to me that the photos just came out right away. My family had a camera too, but we had to wait for the photos to get developed at the store. By that time, I'd always forget and lose interest. but Nikki's new Polaroid camera printed photos out right away. Nikki loved it, and I loved it. His dad really seemed to love it too. When his dad pointed the camera at me, I smiled like a dork and we all laughed at the photo after. My front teeth were missing at the time, and I looked like I was high pretty much. Nikki and I traded our photos after. He kept the photo of me and I kept the photo of him. We said we'd be friends for as long as we kept these photos of each other intact, so I took extra good care of mine. Now that we had this new toy to play with, I was always asking to go over to Nikki's. Because I lived in a house with so many other family members and relatives, I felt lost there sometimes. When I went to Nikki's, I felt more like I belonged. It was always quieter there too. It was the mid-90s at the time, so parents were less strict with their young children, and mine allowed me to spend hours and hours at Nikki's as long as his mother was okay with it too. She always was. She loved having me around because she knew how happy it made Nikki to have a friend to hang out with. My mother would frequently send me to Nikki's house with some sort of dish or snack. She even invited Nikki's family to my house for dinner once. My family really liked his family. I think my older brother even had a tiny crush on his older sister, but she was all about that neighbor boy, so tough luck, bro. For this reason, I was allowed to go to Nikki's house almost every day now. He didn't live too far away either. We were well within walking distance of each other, maybe only 5 blocks away. His house was one of the few places I knew how to get to on my own, apart from my own house. There were times I would go straight to his house with him from school, and times he would come over to play with me at mine. One day at school, Nikki told me his dad had come over the other night and got mad at him for not taking any new photos with a Polaroid he got for his birthday. Both Nikki and I had loved that thing and thought it was very cool the first few times we played around with it, but as most kids do, we eventually lost interest in it. Nikki just sort of tucked it under a blanket in the basement and forgot all about it. I guess his dad didn't like that very much. Nikki asked me if I'd help him take photos for the next time his dad came to visit. In fact, his dad was very specific in requesting that I be in all the photos. I found this perfectly normal as an 8-year-old. I figured Nikki's dad wanted us to have fun with the camera and immortalize our friendship, maybe make a scrapbook or something. Up until this point, Nikki's mother and sister still had no idea he'd ever gotten it. I agreed I would come over soon, and we would take a bunch of silly photos together. But Nikki forgot to mention one thing to me. He forgot to mention his dad would be there. It was the same story as last time. His mother was working, his sister at the mall with friends, presumably with money their dad gave her, and their mother had no way of knowing any of this was going on. I went over there after school and noticed the motorcycle parked out front. Nikki didn't seem surprised to see it, but something about his mood was off that day. I figured it was because he got in trouble the last time he saw his dad. Because it was raining a little, we went inside to hang out in the basement, where I thought we would play on the SNES for a bit. But that wasn't the plan at all. Nikki's dad was in the basement. He greeted me with a big smile and asked how school was, if we did anything fun at recess, what kind of things we learned in class, the usual. I thought nothing of it. My parents would always ask me similar questions too. Eventually, Nikki's dad said we should start taking photos, so I obliged. I smiled widely for the camera, but instead of pressing the button and laughing at the photo like we had done the other day, Nikki's dad tutted at me and said I should try to look prettier. I had no idea what he could mean by that, so I just smiled a little smaller and held it for a second before he corrected me again. As you can imagine, he kept at it, nitpicking me until I let my hair down, telling me to pitch my cheeks before every photo to make sure they were flushed, rosy, and pretty. This whole time, he didn't take a single photo of Nikki. Because it's been decades since, and because I've somehow managed to block most of this out, I'm not entirely sure what led up to it, but Nikki's dad eventually convinced me to start taking articles of clothing off. First my jacket, then my socks, then my cardigan, and then he asked Nikki to get in the frame. This whole time, Nikki had been standing off to the side, not saying a word, and not looking at me either. It looked like he felt something was wrong, but he was too afraid to say so. What ended up happening is exactly what you think. First, Nikki was told to hold my hands, then hug me, then put his face really close to mine. Then he was told to kiss me on the mouth. His dad snapped photos of it every step of the way, asking Nikki these questions like, "Isn't she pretty? Don't you think she's pretty, Nick? Do you want to take her on dates?" It was a whole lot of that and a whole lot of touching. The whole time I stood completely still, not sure what was exactly happening. Had any other boy been there with me, I'm not sure I would have remained so calm. But because it was with Nikki, I felt somewhat safe. I didn't feel like we were doing anything wrong. The kiss was gross to me, but everything else I was mostly okay with. We stopped pretty quickly after that kiss, not because his dad wanted to, but because I had to go home. My mother had just come to pick me up. Usually my brother would, so we could talk to Nikki's sister a little bit, but he had basketball practice that day, so my mother came instead. For some reason, Nikki's dad didn't go up to answer the door. He asked Nikki to do it. I took a second to grab my jacket and sweater and put them back on. During this time, while Nikki's dad and I were alone in the basement, he said he would come back to take more photos one day, and that I should wear makeup next time. I didn't have any at 8 years old, but I didn't tell him that. I just collected my things and got out of there to go home. I saw my mother at the door and she hugged me, asking how my day was, and suddenly everything was normal again. For me, anyway. I glanced back to wave bye to Nicky, but he had already shut the door behind. The next day at school, he completely ignored me. I went to that tree we shared and waited there all morning, all recess, even an extra 15 minutes after school. But he never showed up. I saw him in class, so I knew he was at school. He just didn't want to hang out with me for some reason. This carried on for the rest of the week, until one day my mother got a phone call from Nikki's. I was in the living room watching wrestling with my brother, and I vividly remember my mother's smile immediately vanishing as she listened on the phone to whatever Nikki's mother was saying. I remember asking what was wrong. Was Nikki sick? But my mother wouldn't say anything to me. She just nodded and listened and nodded, face draining of color, as though she had seen a ghost. She pulled me aside to speak with me in my bedroom and asked me very clearly, "Sweetie, who was there at Nick's house the other day? Was it his sister Angela or someone else?" As soon as I said someone else, her eyes became filled with water, and she asked me what happened. I was vague on the details because I wasn't really sure what had happened myself. It was such a blur to me at the time. The only thing I was really worried about was Nicky. Why had he been ignoring me? Because I didn't want him to be more mad at me and ignore me for longer, I kept quiet about that camera, saying Nikki's dad had watched us play and told me I was pretty. Apparently, that last part was enough to set off a huge red flag in my mother's mind. She gave me a big hug and told me she wasn't mad at me and that everything would be okay really soon. I later learned what really happened. Apparently, Nikki's mother had found the camera, asked Angela about it, and then Nikki, quickly learning that their dad had been coming over without her knowledge. The rule was that he could only visit when she was home, but the past few times she hadn't been. The very next day, I found Nikki under the tree at school. He very seriously told me we could not be friends anymore. When I asked him why, he said, just because. He even went so far as giving me back the Polaroid of me smiling like a dork, the one I exchanged for the Polaroid of him, both of them signifying our friendship. Because nothing had really happened, because the world was a very different place 20 years ago, and because the photos weren't explicit in nature. Nothing happened to Nikki's dad. But that's not for lack of trying on our mother's parts. I remember going to the police station, telling them everything as my mother sat there beside me, repeating the story again and again to various lawyers. But the most we were able to accomplish was preventing Nikki's dad from seeing Nikki and Angela again. Apparently, by coming to the house when Nikki's mother wasn't there, he had violated the terms of their custody agreement. When it was all over, the meetings and everything else, Nikki and his family ended up moving. Apparently, Nikki knew this was going to happen, and that's why he told me we couldn't be friends anymore. I want to say I managed to give him the photo back before he left, that we shared one last pudding cup, but I can't, because those things never happened. He moved, and I stayed. And for a really, really long time, I sat alone there at that tree during recess. Eventually, I made new friends. Eventually, I stopped waiting for him to come back. Eventually, I was a happy kid again. But I never, not once in my life, forgot about Nicky or what happened in his basement that day. The way everything about him just changed so drastically. If it weren't for his dad, I like to think we would have remained friends, at least through childhood. The silver lining, though, is that social media exists, and when I was 17, I found a friend request from a boy named Nicky in my notifications. But to Nicky's dad, let's not ever meet again.